Today we're doing a deep dive into a history that, well, it's one that a lot of people tend to look away from, but it's absolutely vital for understanding modern Europe.
It is.
We are jumping into Timothy Snyder's incredible and incredibly difficult book, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin.
Yeah, it's a profound work. And to be honest, it's an emotionally draining read, but for good reason. Snyder's whole mission is to connect the dots, to unify the history of mass murder by both the Nazi and Soviet regimes.
Right.
And he focuses squarely on this one zone of Europe that they both fought over and, ultimately just decimated, the region he calls the Bloodlands.
Exactly. So our goal for this deep dive is to try and understand how, and maybe even why, these two massive totalitarian systems managed to murder around 14 million non-combatants.
14 million.
In the same relatively small part of the world over just 12 years, from 1933 to 1945. And just as important, we want to trace how the way we remember these crimes separately has, well, it's really skewed how we understand the whole 20th century.
It's so important to start with the geography. You have to picture it. The Bloodlands are essentially the territories caught between Berlin and Moscow. So we're talking about an area that goes from central Poland east through Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, all the way to Western Russia. And this land wasn't just a backdrop for the killing, it was the prize. It was where both regimes wanted to build their empires, get food, and carry out their ideological projects.
And the number that just anchors this whole thing, it's staggering. Snyder makes it so clear that of those 14 million people murdered, none were soldiers killed in combat.
None.
They were non-combatants, women, children, the elderly. They were victims of deliberate, systematic, murderous policy, not just the collateral damage of war.
And the victims were primarily the people who actually lived there. Jews, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, Russians, and Balts. And Snyder's approach is so crucial because he doesn't treat this as two separate stories.
Right, not as parallel histories.
Exactly. He shows how these policies unfolded chronologically, one often influencing or even provoking the other, all within this one terrifying geographical space.
Okay, so let's start our chronological journey. We begin in 1933, before Hitler's killing machine was really at full steam. We start with Stalin. We start with the Soviet famines.
Chapter 1, the Soviet famines.
Right.
So the first major wave of this systematic killing in the Bloodlands, it doesn't start with gas chambers. It starts with a political weapon.
Starvation.
Mass starvation, wielded deliberately by the state and centered right in Soviet Ukraine in 1932 and 1933.
The stories from that time, they're almost impossible to process. The book is full of these accounts of just absolute desperation.
Terrifying.
There's that story of the little boy, Josef Sobolewski, who's just wandering down a road repeating, "Now we will live." He's hallucinating that food is coming.
And it never does.
It never comes. He dies, along with over 3 million other people.
And this famine, which we now know as the Holodomor, it was directly tied to Stalin's policy of forced collectivization. The state wanted to get rid of the kulaks.
Who were the kulaks, exactly?
Well, they were a politically defined class of supposedly wealthier peasants, but in reality, the definition was flexible. It could be anyone who resisted collectivization. So the goal was to eliminate them and, at the same time, break the back of Ukrainian nationalism. This wasn't a policy failure. It was a tool of control.
And the tool itself was just brutal.
Oh, completely. The state launched these huge campaigns to requisition grain. When people had nothing left, armed groups would come and search their houses, their barns. They'd even dig up their fields looking for buried food, taking every last seed.
So that's the core point that Snyder makes, right? This wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a drought.
Not at all. The state kept taking grain even while everyone was starving to death. A simple pause in grain exports, just a temporary halt, would have saved millions. But they didn't do it.
But Stalin, through people like Lazar Kaganovich, he doubled down. He demanded Ukraine meet these impossibly high quotas in December 1932.
And that demand, that resolution they passed, it was effectively a death sentence for about 3 million people. The failure to meet an ideological target collectivization was immediately relabeled as sabotage.
So enemy action.
Exactly, which then justified seizing all their food as a punishment. Snyder's estimate is that about 3.3 million people died from starvation and disease in Soviet Ukraine alone in those 2 years. The dying itself was the political tool.
And for those who didn't starve but were labeled as enemies, they ended up in the gulag.
Right. This was Stalin's project of internal colonization. About 1.7 million kulaks, including 300,000 Ukrainians, were deported to these special settlements and labor camps.
The Belomor Canal construction is a perfect grim example.
A terrible example. 170,000 people forced to dig through frozen ground with, picks and shovels. The conditions were so inhuman that thousands just died from exhaustion and disease. There are accounts of bodies being carted off to the cemetery in 3s and 4s without coffins.
The book also details the complete psychological breakdown of society. I mean, the hunger led to widespread cannibalism.
Yes, there are verified accounts of families killing their weakest members, usually children, just to survive.
It's unimaginable.
There's a quote from this chapter that I can't forget. It's an observation from a survivor. The good people died first. Those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died.
Wow.
When survival itself depends on abandoning your morality, the state has achieved a level of terror that it wipes out any possibility of future resistance.
Okay, so Chapter 2, Class Terror. The famine begins to wind down around 1934, but its timing is tragically convenient because it happens just as Hitler is consolidating power in Germany.
Right. Hitler's rise in 1933 immediately pulls the world's attention away from the millions dying in Ukraine.
And he was very, very clever about it.
Extremely tactical. He uses the Reichstag fire in February 1933, blames it on the communists, and that becomes his pretext.
The emergency decree.
Exactly. It lets him suspend the civil rights of every German citizen and build a one-party state almost overnight. Dachau opens just a few weeks later, in March of 1933.
But at this early stage, Nazi terror was mostly aimed at political opponents, right?
Yeah.
Communists, social democrats.
Yes, and it was usually for what they called protective custody. It was about intimidation. Most people were actually released after a while. It was brutal, for sure, but it wasn't systematic killing. Not yet.
Meanwhile, Stalin pulls off this brilliant political move on the world stage.
He does. Starting around 1934, he starts presenting the USSR as the global leader of anti-fascism with his Popular Front policy. It's a huge distraction. At the same time, he ends the famine at home by letting peasants have these tiny private plots of land.
But this external face of anti-fascism was just a mask for what was happening internally.
A complete mask. Stalin introduces this terrifying new logic. He argues that as socialism succeeds, resistance doesn't go away, it actually increases.
So any problem, any failure, has to be the work of secret enemies.
It has to be enemy action by saboteurs, and that becomes the justification for the massive purges that follow, the period we call the Great Terror, which peaks in 1937 and 1938.
And the really chilling part is how bureaucratic it was. It wasn't random violence.
Not at all. The key document here is NKVD Order 00447. It was supposed to target kulak resistance, but it quickly grew to include almost anyone. And this was all centrally planned. Moscow literally sent death quotas, numerical targets for arrests and executions down to all the regional NKVD offices.
The quotas, I find that part so disturbing. It wasn't just about meeting the number.
No, it became a sick kind of competition. Local NKVD officers would write back to Moscow and beg for higher quotas. They'd argue their region had more enemies than the central planners thought.
Unbelievable.
The lists were just drawn up, based on who'd been arrested before, just arbitrary categories. In 1937-1938, hundreds of thousands of people, mostly peasants and workers, the very people the state claimed to represent, were shot. In Soviet Ukraine alone, over 70,000 were executed in just the Kulak operation.
And this shift from exile to just immediate execution, was that ideological?
It was often just practical, which is almost more horrifying. The Gulag was already full. There was literally no space to put all the people the system had labeled as enemies.
So Chapter 3. National terror. This is where the class terror kind of morphs into something even more specific and even more deadly.
It does. The state now turns against specific diaspora nationalities living within its own borders.
Enemy nations.
That's the concept, yeah. Under the NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhov, they start prioritizing nationalities that were associated with countries seen as a threat. And the most devastating of these campaigns, the one most central to the Bloodlands, was the Polish operation.
And the whole justification for it was a complete fabrication.
A pure bureaucratic fantasy, as Snyder calls it. They invented this idea of a massive Polish military organization working as a spy network all across the Soviet Union. And that was the excuse they needed to justify killing Soviet Poles en masse.
It boiled down to this horrifyingly simple equation.
It did. The NKVD's internal shorthand basically said it all. Once a Pole, always a kulak. Your nationality itself was the crime.
And the numbers just prove how targeted this was.
They're terrifyingly precise. Across the entire Soviet Union, 247,157 people were killed in these national operations, targeting Poles, Latvians, Estonians, and Finns.
Wow.
Now think about this. Those groups combined made up only 1.6% of the Soviet population, but they accounted for 36% of all the deaths in the Great Terror.
36%.
In Soviet Ukraine, 47,327 people were shot in the Polish operation alone.
And on top of the killings, there was this layer of systematic deception.
Always. The NKVD lied to the families. They told the sister of Janina Jurevich, whose husband was shot in 1937, that the sentence was 10 years without the right to correspondence.
So people held out hope for decades.
For decades. They thought their loved ones were just in a camp somewhere and might come back one day. This enforced ignorance, this lie, it was a key part of the terror.
And if you were arrested in one of these national sweeps, your chances of survival were basically zero.
You had a 3 in 4 chance of being shot immediately. And again, the logic was just brutally practical. The gulag was overflowing from the class terror, so execution was just the easiest path for the bureaucracy.
It's a really stark contrast with what the Nazis were doing at the same time in 36 to 38.
It is. The Nazi terror then, while awful, was focused on confinement, on improving so-called asocials, homosexuals, vagrants through labor. It wasn't yet this quota-driven, immediate mass execution. At that specific moment in history, Stalin's system was, frankly, the more efficient and immediate killing machine.
Okay, that brings us to 1939, and we shift from these two regimes operating separately to a horrifying partnership as the Bloodlands are formally carved up by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Chapter 4, Molotov-Ribbentrop Europe.
This pact was, it was just deeply, deeply cynical.
Oh, completely. From Stalin's perspective, it was a golden opportunity. He could sit back and let the capitalist powers, Germany, Britain, France, destroy each other. His stated goal was, and I'm quoting here, destroy the enemies by their own hands and remain strong to the end of the war.
And the immediate result, of course, was the invasion and partition of Poland in September 1939. And the German brutality was instant.
And intentional. The German advance was filled with this casual cruelty that was designed to terrorize everyone and eliminate any potential Polish leaders.
Right.
You see incidents like the murder of 300 captured Polish soldiers at Sipilo. They forced them to take their uniforms off so they would look like partisans, and then they just gunned them down.
And they did the same to civilians.
Constantly. Like the 40 Polish citizens they locked in a building in Longanoka and just burned alive.
And this invasion was also the first time that most German soldiers encountered the large religious Jewish communities of Eastern Poland.
Yes, which were very different from the assimilated Jewish communities they knew back in Germany.
And the reaction was immediate violence.
Immediate dehumanization. Shaving beards and side curls, forcing religious leaders to do humiliating things. Rape. This early phase of the occupation was already a testing ground for atrocities against both Poles and Jews.
At the same time, the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland was bringing its own terror, which of course leads to the Katyn massacre.
Right. Polish officers, civil servants, doctors, engineers, basically the entire Polish elite in that region were rounded up. And despite all these promises of safety, even from people like Nikita Khrushchev, they were sent to NKVD camps.
And the decision to kill them was made in 1940.
Yes, part of about 200,000 Polish citizens who were shot by either the Soviets or the Germans during that initial partition.
The details of the Katyn executions they're so methodical.
It really highlights the Soviet efficiency in this kind of targeted killing. Officers were shot one by one in the back of the neck. Their bodies were piled onto trucks and dumped in mass graves. We even have the diary of Adam Solsky, which was found on his body. The last entry just stops right before he was executed.
And this act, killing the intelligentsia, it served both German and Soviet goals.
Perfectly. Eliminate the Polish elites, and you ensure that the idea of an independent Poland can never really come back.
So this geography of terror gets formalized. Poland is split down the Molotov-Ribbentrop line. Let's talk about the German zone first, the general government.
The general government was basically central and southern Poland. It wasn't formally annexed into Germany. It was run as a brutal colonial territory, a dumping ground for Poles and Jews. Hitler's order was explicit. Exterminate the Polish intelligentsia.
And the Soviet zone mirrored that exactly.
Exactly. They also targeted Polish elites. The NKVD literally used a Polish who's who encyclopedia to help them identify targets for execution. So for this brief period, you have two totalitarian states working together to erase a nation from the map.
Which brings us to Chapter 5, the economics of apocalypse. So despite all their political differences, this alliance covered up a huge, shared imperial goal: autarky.
Yes. Both Hitler and Stalin were obsessed with the idea of a large, self-sufficient land empire that wasn't dependent on world markets. That was the key to power.
But their methods for achieving it were different.
Very different, and it's a crucial distinction. Stalin's socialism in one country was an internal colonization project. He was subduing his own people, his own peasants, to fuel industrialization.
Right.
Hitler's vision, Lebensraum, or living space, required external colonization. He saw Eastern Europe, which he planned to seize from the USSR, as the farmland and resource base that would make Germany self-sufficient and, in his words, unassailable.
And this ideological need for resources is what leads directly to Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. It was planned as a blitzkrieg, a lightning victory.
The arrogance was just immense. German commanders called the USSR a house of cards. They expected a total collapse in 9 to 12 weeks.
Which led to some catastrophic planning mistakes.
Huge mistakes. They made no real logistical plans for a long war, including the most basic thing: how to feed their own army.
And when the Red Army didn't collapse, the Germans had to make a really terrible choice.
But terrible pivot. By September 1941, the invasion had stalled, and that's when Hermann Goering issues the Hunger Plan. The logic was simple. Since the Wehrmacht can't be supplied from Germany, they must live off the land.
Which meant stealing all the food.
Systematically seizing all food resources from the occupied Soviet territories. This guaranteed the starvation of millions of Soviet citizens so that German soldiers and civilians could eat.
This is basically institutionalizing mass murder through scarcity.
It's an exact mirror of what Stalin did in 1933, just on an external imperial scale. German soldiers were literally taught that any food eaten by a Soviet was food being stolen from a German child. Hunger was no longer a tragedy, it was redefined as enemy agitation.
And you see the immediate result of this policy in how they treated Soviet prisoners of war.
The brutality is just off the charts. Captured Red Army soldiers were marched for hundreds of kilometers. The prisoners from Kiev were marched over 400 kilometers. They were beaten, and if they sat down from exhaustion, they were shot.
The death rates were insane.
Up to 70% during transport alone. The policy was clearly attrition. The overall death rate for Soviet POWs in German camps was 57.5%.
57%.
Compare that to less than 5% for Western Allied prisoners. Millions of Soviet soldiers died, not in battle, but starving to death because of German policy.
So, Chapter 6, final solution. The failure of Barbarossa to be a quick war has this direct, awful consequence for German policy toward the Jews.
It does. Hitler's original plan was to deport the Jews east after a victory. But now he's stuck, bogged down in a long war, controlling the one region with the densest Jewish population in the world, about 5 million people.
And all the previous deportation plans had failed by this point.
Right. The book confirms that 4 plans, the Lublin Reservation idea, the Madagascar plan, they had all fallen apart by late 1941. When the dream of a quick victory died, the idea of a massive post-war deportation died with it. So the physical presence of 5 million Jews in the Bloodlands demanded a new, radical solution.
And Himmler is the one who pushes it forward.
Himmler pushes for mass murder during the war.
And that kicks off the mass shooting campaigns east of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line.
The killing just escalates incredibly fast in the summer and fall of 1941. You have the Einsatzgruppen, regular Wehrmacht units, order police, and thousands of local collaborators all mobilized for these massive shootings. By the end of 1941, they had murdered about 1 million Jews with bullets, east of that old partition line.
And Babi Yar in Kyiv in September 41 is just the most horrifying example of this escalation.
It is. German forces in Kyiv took some casualties from Soviet mines left behind. They immediately blamed the local Jewish population, and that became the pretext.
The scale of the killing was...
It was industrial. 33,761 Jews were marched out of the city, stripped naked, and murdered over just 36 hours. The few survivors, like Dina Pranicheva, described the anatomy of the crime. Victims were forced to lie down on top of the corpses already in the ravine and wait for the shots from above.
At this point, the Germans are also experimenting with other ways to kill. Faster ways.
And ways that were less psychologically damaging for the killers. They tested gas vans in Kyiv and later in Kharkiv, where they killed over 10,000 Jews. But the police actually rejected them.
Right.
They complained that removing the mangled corpses covered with blood and excrement was too messy and upsetting for the men doing it. They preferred the relative cleanliness of shooting.
Which all leads to Hitler's big decision in December 1941.
The fifth and final version of the final solution. the decision to kill all European Jews. This is the moment when the official euphemism resettlement is formally changed to mean mass murder. The goal is now total, immediate annihilation.
Okay, that brings us into Section 3, the peak of the German killing, and also the rise of resistance from 1942 to 1944. And the focus really narrows in on places like Belarus, which becomes the symbolic center of this whole conflict.
Chapter 7, Holocaust and Revenge.
Right.
Minsk, the capital of Belarus, was just devastated. It had the largest ghetto in the pre-war USSR. And while this systematic murder is going on, Stalin is very carefully controlling the narrative of the war.
A narrative that was specifically designed to erase the unique suffering of the Jews.
Precisely. Stalin defined all victims as just Soviet citizens, and he made it clear the Russians were first among equals. When he finally did acknowledge the murder of Jews in November 41, he called it pogroms.
Downplaying it.
Deliberately obscuring the planned industrial nature of what was happening and, not even mentioning that the victims were overwhelmingly Jewish.
And meanwhile, the conditions in ghettos like Minsk were just apocalyptic.
It was called a dead city. The accounts from the winter of 41-42 describe rape and murder as just daily events. And the Germans, as partisan resistance started to grow in the forests, they needed an excuse for killing so many non-combatants. So they invented the partisan lie.
What exactly was the partisan lie?
It was a simple, deadly equation that became official German policy. Where there are partisans, there are Jews, and where there are Jews, there are partisans. So bureaucratically, the mass murder of Jewish civilians was redefined as a legitimate anti-partisan reprisal.
But their own reports proved that wasn't true.
Their own reports condemn them. There's one example in the book, a Wehrmacht report, that says 10,431 partisans were shot, but only 90 guns were found.
Wow.
The math tells the story. At least 90% of the 350,000 people killed in these so-called anti-partisan campaigns were unarmed civilians, mostly Belarusians, Poles, and Jews.
This creates what Snyder calls interactive terror.
Yes, and it's a devastating insight. German terror, by killing civilians and destroying any chance for a non-Soviet political resistance, actually pushed desperate survivors, including Jewish partisan groups like the Bielski Brothers Unit, directly into the arms of the Soviet partisans in the forest.
So Hitler's atrocities were, ironically, helping Stalin.
They were multiplying Stalin's forces and ensuring that if and when the Germans were pushed out, the Soviets would be the only power left to take control.
Okay, so Chapter 8, the Nazi death factories. We have to now turn to the industrialized phase of the murder.
Yeah.
And Snyder makes this really clear geographical distinction.
He does. East of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, the primary method was billets. That's about 2 million dead. West of the line, mainly in occupied Poland, the general government, that meant gas.
And this shift is what's known as Operation Reinhard.
Right. It was focused on 6 main death facilities: Chemno, Bushik, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. And it's so important for you, the listener, to understand what these places were. They were not concentration camps where you might work for months or years.
They are factories.
They're factories designed for one purpose: immediate death upon arrival.
And this was a concept that the Nazis had already tested on their own citizens.
Exactly. The technology and the personnel were brought over from the euthanasia program of 1939-41, where they had murdered German citizens deemed unworthy of life. The handicapped, the mentally ill using carbon monoxide, they just applied that same industrial model to the Jews.
Let's talk about the efficiency of a place like Treblinka.
The speed was it's mind-boggling. The facilities were often run by what were called Troniki men.
Who were they?
They were former Soviet POWs, often Ukrainians, who agreed to collaborate with the Germans and became the guards and the killers. The early days were chaotic, but once the gas chambers were built, it became a conveyor belt of death. At Beruk, the entire process, from the train arriving to the bodies being disposed of, took no more than 2 hours.
And once the killing started, the Germans became obsessed with destroying the evidence.
Completely obsessed. They used Jewish slave laborers for this gruesome work. After the initial mass graves, they started building these huge pyres out of railway rails, sometimes 30 meters wide, burning bodies day and night to turn them to ash.
And some of those Jewish workers left behind notes.
Survivors' last words, Snyder calls them. They risk everything, stuffing messages into bottles. We have these heartbreaking final words like Chill Rochman telling his sister it's no use about their luggage, or Hannah Levinson telling her barber to escape and tell the world what was happening at Treblinka.
It's also really important to put Auschwitz in the right context here.
It is. Auschwitz was the biggest and the most famous camp, and it was both a labor camp and a killing center. But it was not the main place where the Jews of the Bloodlands were killed.
Right.
The vast majority of Soviet Jews, less than 1% of them died at Auschwitz, and most Polish Jews died in the Operation Reinhard camps like Majork and Treblinka, or they were shot in the east. Snyder shows that the majority of the 5.4 million Jewish victims died in these killing fields and death factories, not in the concentration camps that the West became familiar with after the war.
Okay, so Chapter 9, Resistance and Incineration. The focus here is on Warsaw, the heart of Polish resistance, which saw two defining tragic moments. First, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943.
It's one of history's greatest acts of defiance. The Jews in the ghetto knew exactly what deportation meant by then. They knew it meant Treblinka, so they fought without any hope of winning. It was a moral act. If they were going to die, they would die fighting.
And Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, used a Soviet crime to try and undermine them, right before the Germans attacked the ghetto.
A truly cynical move. On April 18, 1943, Goebbels announced to the world that the Germans had discovered the Caton graves, exposing the NKVD's massacre of Polish officers from 1940.
And the timing was deliberate?
Entirely. He wanted to alienate Poles from Jews, to drive a wedge between them right as the ghetto was being destroyed by saying, look, the supposedly Jewish leadership in Moscow is killing your people too.
Then we have the larger Warsaw Uprising in August 1944. This was launched by the Polish Home Army.
And their calculation was desperate. They wanted to liberate their own capital and establish Polish sovereignty before the Red Army got there.
But Stalin's calculation was much, much colder.
Cold-blooded. He deliberately halted his army's advance on the other side of the Vistula River. He had encouraged the uprising, but now he just sat back and withheld all aid, letting the Germans spend 63 days crushing the city.
Why?
Because the Germans were doing his dirty work for him. They were destroying the very heart of the non-Soviet Polish intelligentsia, the people most likely to resist future Soviet rule. It was a calculated, devastating political move.
By the time the Soviets finally entered the city in January 1945, Warsaw was just rubble and ash. And this leads to a really crucial point about how the West remembered the war.
It's the geography of liberation. All of Hitler's main killing sites, the death factories, the shooting pits, were on land that was later occupied by the Soviets. The Red Army liberated Auschwitz, Treblinka, Babi Yar.
And the Western Allies liberated camps like Dachau and Belsen.
Right, which were horrific concentration camps, but they were not primarily death facilities. And this geographical split completely biased the Western perception of the Holocaust for decades, leading to a focus on concentration camps rather than the industrial mass murder that happened almost entirely in the Bloodlands.
We're now moving into the post-war period, Section 4. Stalin's victory wasn't just military. He also fundamentally reshaped the population of the Bloodlands through massive ethnic cleansing.
Chapter 10, Ethnic Cleansings.
Yeah.
The immediate aftermath of the war saw the Red Army enter Germany with just extraordinary violence. Historians estimate something like 400,000 German women were victims of mass rape, partly because so many German men were dead or prisoners.
And this was followed by these huge forced population shifts.
Yeah.
The Allies had agreed that Poland would be shifted west, taking huge chunks of German territory.
And this required the forced expulsion of millions of Germans. By the end of 1947, 7.6 million Germans had been forced out of what was now Poland, and Stalin guaranteed Poland's new western border.
Which was a brilliant political move on his part.
Brilliant and cynical. By giving Poland all this new land taken from Germany, he made the Polish state totally dependent on the Red Army to protect it from any future German attempt to take it back.
So it was this chaotic, violent demographic swap.
A great population exchange. Germans moved west, Poles moved west into those recovered territories, and Ukrainians were forcibly sent to Soviet Ukraine. And on top of that, the Soviets continued their own internal deportations. The Gulag didn't shrink after the war.
It got bigger.
It reached its peak inmate population after the war. For example, between 1944 and 1946, they deported over 180,000 Ukrainians just for being related to someone accused of nationalism.
The scale of the displacement itself is staggering, separate from the killing.
It is. The total number of people forcibly displaced across the Bloodlands, Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, and others, was over 12 million. That's on top of the 10 million who were deliberately killed. This ethnic cleansing campaign violently homogenized the map of Eastern Europe.
Which brings us to Chapter 11, Stalinist anti-Semitism. The Holocaust, as an event, created a real problem for the Soviet Union's story about the war.
A huge problem for their myth-making. The Soviet narrative was all about the unity of the Great Patriotic War. But the murder of the Jews crossed national borders, and crucially, a lot of it happened while the Soviets and Nazis were allies.
So the unique suffering of the Jews had to be erased.
It had to be suppressed to maintain the myth. Any attempt to document the Holocaust, like the famous Black Book of Soviet Jewry by Vasily Grossman, was systematically blocked by Stalin's propaganda chief. Monuments couldn't have stars of David on them, they just honored generic Soviet citizens.
And this suppression then escalated into active state anti-Semitism, driven by Stalin's paranoia about the West and the creation of Israel in 1948.
Suddenly, Soviet Jews became suspect. Their loyalty was questioned. Could they be more loyal to the new U.S.-backed state of Israel? They were branded rootless cosmopolitans, Zionists, and this led to purges of high-ranking Jewish officers and intellectuals.
And the final terrifying wave was the Doctors' Plot in 1952-53.
A chilling state-sponsored conspiracy theory. Jewish doctors were accused of medical terrorism, of being paid by American and Zionist spies to kill Soviet leaders. Snyder suggests that many people at the time feared Stalin was preparing for another massive national operation, maybe even the deportation of the entire Jewish people.
And you see the same historical distortion happening in the Soviet satellite states, like Poland.
Yes, where prominent Jewish communists like Jakub Berman were forced to suppress the memory of the Holocaust in their own country to prove their loyalty to Moscow. They literally rewrote the history of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising to be a communist-led Polish revolt.
So the specifically Jewish experience was just written out of history.
It was. The Holocaust was reduced to just another instance of fascism, a truly devastating moral compromise.
Okay, so to wrap this all up, this deep dive into Bloodlands,
Yeah.
it really forces you to rethink the whole story of the 20th century. Snyder's goal was to describe this course of mass murder, and by doing that, to introduce, as he says, to European history its central event.
And he forces us to confront the fact that these crimes were concentrated both in time and in space. Let's just run through the numbers one last time. By Soviet policy, you have over 5 million starved during collectivization and nearly 700,000 executed in the Great Terror.
And by German policy.
Over 4 million starved POWs, civilians in Leningrad, and 5.4 million Jews shot and gassed. The combined toll is just. It's almost beyond comprehension.
Now, Snyder makes a really conscious choice to weigh these deaths equally. He focuses on the method of killing more than the ideology behind it. And this is where some people criticize him.
It is.
He's saying Stalin starving millions for political goals is a moral equivalent to Hitler starving millions for logistical goals. How does he defend that comparison?
That is the absolute heart of the debate, and it's where Snyder's analysis is so sharp. He defends it by focusing on the political mechanism. Both regimes started from the same premise: the creation of a fantasy world, a world without kulaks, a world without Jews, and the conscious, willing reduction of human beings to expendable obstacles.
Right.
Stalin's famine was internal colonization. Hitler's hunger plan was external colonization. But both required the dehumanization and systematic liquidation of millions who stood in the way of their ideological dream.
And that distinction he makes between concentration camps and killing sites is so vital for correcting our memory of the war.
It's absolutely crucial. A concentration camp like Dachau was a place of labor where survival was at least possible. A killing site like Boshek was a factory for immediate certain death. The vast majority of the 14 million victims died quickly by bullets or by gas and never even saw a concentration camp.
And Snyder argues that the ultimate lesson from all this isn't just to identify with the victims.
No, he directs us to a much harder task: to understand the perpetrator and the bystander. Both Hitler and Stalin justified their violence by claiming that they were the victims of an international conspiracy, be it capitalist or Jewish. The human capacity to see oneself as a victim is, it's limitless. And history shows that people who believe they're under attack can be motivated to do terrible, violent things.
Which leaves us with a final, really challenging thought about what history is for.
We have to resist that temptation to just dismiss the perpetrators as incomprehensible monsters or as something beyond human concern, because if we do that, we're falling into their moral trap. We're abdicating our responsibility to understand their logic.
Right.
The hard and frankly repulsive work of history is to realize that the motives for mass murder, as insane as they seem to us, made perfect rational sense to them inside the closed ideological worlds they had built. And understanding that dangerous internal logic is the only way we can ever hope to recognize those mechanisms of atrocity if they start to reemerge.
That is a profound and necessary charge for all of us. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into Bloodlands. As you think about this history, please remember that these numbers aren't abstract. They represent 14 million times one individual life, each one with a story, each one an incalculable loss, all concentrated right there in the middle of Europe.
Knowledge of our most difficult past. It's a journey we all have to keep taking.
Until next time.